Eternalism for Beginners, Unit 19, Overview Quiz. Welcome to the Unit 19 Overview Quiz. This short quiz will reinforce your understanding of the gospel and the philosophy of eternalism. You'll answer 6 true or false questions, each followed by a brief explanation. Then we'll conclude with a bonus question, challenging you to identify the one true source of rights from a list of possible contenders. Think carefully, only one aligns with reality and provides an objective foundation. In this exercise, there are 6 true or false questions. Question number 1. The primacy of consciousness means that reality is shaped entirely by thought, will, or belief. Answer: true. Explanation: the primacy of consciousness asserts that reality conforms to mind and will. However, as we demonstrated, this position is false. Existence is primary, and consciousness operates within it, not over it. Question number 2. The 3-tier thinking model helps clarify how consciousness operates within existence, not above it. Answer: true. Explanation: 2-tier thinking establishes the primacy of existence, and 3-tier thinking shows how consciousness adapts, responds, and flourishes within reality, rather than attempting to override it. Question number 3. Frustrations in daily life are not natural, but are signs of existence tyrannizing over consciousness, something that must be overcome by sheer willpower. Answer: false. Explanation: frustrations are a natural part of life, because reality operates independently of personal desires. The primacy of existence means that we must work within reality, not impose our will over it. Denying reality and insisting that willpower alone can eliminate frustrations leads to failure and disillusionment. Question number 4. The primacy of existence means that reality exists independently of anyone's thoughts, desires, or beliefs. Answer: true. Explanation: reality is objective and absolute. It exists whether we recognize it or not. The primacy of existence means that consciousness must conform to reality, not the other way around. Question number 5. If the primacy of consciousness were true, there would be no personal frustrations, conflicts, or natural disasters. Answer: true. Explanation: if will alone shaped reality, no one would experience suffering, disagreement, or hardship, yet these are universal and inescapable, proving the primacy of existence. Question number 6. The ultimate existential proof against the primacy of consciousness is death. Answer: true. Explanation: death is inescapable, proving that will cannot override existence. If consciousness were primary, no one would die unless they chose to, yet everyone dies, proving reality dictates the terms. Building on our discussion of rights and leading into the next unit on force, here's a bonus question about the possible sources of rights. Which one is correct? Here's a hint. There's only one right answer. Read through the options and mentally check off the one that aligns with what we've covered on the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness. Let's review each option. If God is the source of rights, then rights are understood as being endowed by divine decree. If the state is the source of rights, then rights are understood as legal privileges granted by the state. If society is the source of rights, then rights are understood as a product of the collective will. If the individual is the source of rights, then rights are understood to exist by personal assertion. If the law of the jungle is the source of rights, then rights are understood to be dictated by brute force. If man's nature is the source of rights, then rights are understood to arise from his rational, volitional nature within a social context. Since we begin with God as our first option, a controversial issue, we pause to apply our 2- and 3-tier thinking to clarify a key question. Which has primacy, God or rights? Here we are not referring to God as a person, but as an authority figure, the creator of all things. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, which, for most Americans or Christians, clearly gives Tier 1 status, and thus primacy, to the creator God over human rights. However, this raises several issues, prompting us to ask, why is this a problem? 4 key questions emerge. First, which God? Are we referring to the Muslim, Jewish, or Christian God? What about pagan gods? Second, what if one is an atheist? What then? Do rights cease to exist without God? Third, are rights subjective? If God is the source of rights, does that make them dependent on his will, rather than on an objective standard grounded in reality? And fourth, does this imply the primacy of consciousness? If rights originate in God's will, does that place consciousness above existence? All 4 questions pose significant challenges, starting with the fact that placing God above rights inherently assumes the primacy of consciousness. This exercise introduces a philosophical tool for addressing gospel primacy issues, such as God versus rights. If the primacy of consciousness is given Tier 1 status, it should be dismissed as a fallacy. However, if the primacy of existence is given Tier 1 status, it should be accepted as true, or at least retained for further analysis, as we transition from 2 to 3-tier thinking to clarify any misunderstandings. Let's apply this now. We have established rights as Tier 1, giving them primacy over God in an existential sense, as rights are discovered, not created. With God at Tier 2, we now reassign rights at Tier 3, recognizing the primacy of consciousness in a new contextual, derivative, and relational sense, meaning, in a relational sense, rights must be upheld and secured by moral and legal agents, with God, for believers, as the highest authority. Again, notice God's transitional and pivotal role at Tier 2. As this contextual and derivative transition from Tiers 1 and 2 to Tiers 2 and 3 implies that while rights exist independently, they require recognition, enforcement, and protection by divine law, governance, or society. Without moral and legal agents to uphold them, rights remain, rights in name only, and not in fact. With this insight in the primacy of consciousness versus primacy of existence distinction in hand, let's return to our original bonus question. Okay, we can now begin with this question. How do we know God isn't the source of rights? Because if rights were divinely endowed, they could be revoked by divine decree, making them subjective, not objective, and rooted in the primacy of consciousness, not existence. How do we know the state isn't the source of rights? Because if the state granted them, it could revoke them, making rights subjective, not objective, and rooted in the primacy of consciousness, not existence. How do we know society isn't the source of rights? Because if rights depended on majority rule, the minority would be at the mercy of the majority, making them subjective, not objective, and rooted in the primacy of consciousness, not existence. How do we know the individual isn't the source of rights? Because rights would then be based on personal whims, making them subjective, not objective, and rooted in the primacy of consciousness, not existence. How do we know the law of the jungle isn't the source of rights? Because it reduces rights to brute force, might makes right, making them subjective, not objective, and rooted in the primacy of consciousness, not existence. How do we know man's nature is the true source of rights? Because rights arise from his rational, volitional nature within a social context, making them objective, not subjective, and rooted in the primacy of existence, not consciousness. Our examination of competing sources of rights, God, the state, society, the individual, and the law of the jungle, or the survival of the fittest, reveals that all but one share a fatal flaw. They are rooted in the primacy of consciousness. Each of these false sources rests on an arbitrary will, whether divine, governmental, collective, personal, or brute force, making rights subjective, revocable, and dependent on power, rather than reality. If rights could be granted or taken away by decree, vote, or force, they would not be rights at all, but privileges subject to those in control. In contrast, only rights derived from man's nature align with the primacy of existence. They are not granted by external forces, but discovered as necessary conditions for a rational, volitional being to act, think, and thrive within a social context. This distinction is crucial. By eliminating all sources of rights grounded in the primacy of consciousness, we are left with the only objective foundation: man's nature. Rights are not privileges or permissions. They are moral principles rooted in reality, independent of authority, power, or opinion. Thank you for participating. Join us for Unit 20, where we'll continue our exploration of the most important gospel primacy issue of all, the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness. In the meantime, use this bonus question on the primacy of God versus rights to deepen your gospel understanding of God, rights, and the distinction between the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness.